Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the Deceptive Sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. We've now looked at this concept of deceptive sexuality by using the secret sexual basement metaphor, and in particular, we've gone into some depth now about the two behavioral systems, the compulsive entitled sexuality and the integrity abuse, that together define deceptive sexuality. If we now go back to the name of the model itself, DST or deceptive sexuality trauma, we now need to look at that next part. What is the trauma that is caused by the deceptive sexuality? What is the impact on the family system? And in particular, what is the impact on the intimate partner? And I do really want to acknowledge here that when we talk about the trauma, that topic in itself might be very difficult for some of you listening, especially if it's something you've experienced or you're experiencing right now. I also do want to acknowledge that there's an extremely wide scope of impact, and so no two people will ever experience it in exactly the same way. So just remember that we're looking at general principles here today. Now in this episode, as a starting point, I'm going to zoom out a bit and give a brief overview of two of the key types of trauma that we need to be aware of if we want to begin at least to understand the impact of deceptive sexuality. And then in subsequent episodes, we'll be able to dive into each of these ideas in a little bit more depth. And I also think it's important to maybe take a slight detour here to look at the longer-term development of the sex addiction field, because it is very relevant to today's topic, especially to partner trauma. So since the initial proposal of sex addiction as a concept, as a treatment field, there have been two important shifts from my perspective that directly relate to our understanding of the partner's experience. And one of those shifts is fairly well established now, and one of them is very, very new, and in part is really what I'm trying to illuminate here with these podcasts. So originally, partners of the people that were identified as sex addicts were often, and dare I say generally, labeled as codependent. That is to say that their responses and behaviors after discovery were seen as unhealthy patterns of codependence, so a problem that the partners needed to work on for themselves. It's an idea that was taken from alcohol addiction work, in particular within the 12-step model, where the partners of alcoholics and other people perhaps around them often tend to develop unhealthy patterns of coping that might end up enabling the addict in some ways and so therefore contribute to the problem in some ways. And again, this idea would be that the partner therefore has their own work to do. They need to metaphorically stay in their lane and do their own work and not interfere with or try and control the addict. Unfortunately, when this kind of thinking was applied to the partners of sex addicts, it naturally led to significant pathologizing of those partners and their trauma reactions. Unfortunately, this is where, eventually at least, the first big shift in the field occurred, which was to start understanding the experience and the reactions of the partner of the sex addict through the lens of trauma, rather than through the lens of codependency. And I would say that, certainly in hindsight, one of the primary reasons for that is actually quite obvious. So if the compulsive or addictive behavior was completely hidden from the partner, how can we then label the partner as being codependent? So how can the partner have developed unhealthy, codependent patterns of coping with something that they didn't even know about? So that shift in itself is a critically important and significant movement towards justice for the partners who historically at least have been so unfairly labelled. The next significant shift in the field, which I believe is slowly occurring as we speak, and which again is really what I'm trying to illuminate here, is to not only see the partner's experience through the lens of trauma rather than codependency, but to also understand the potentially abusive behaviors involved when a secret sexual reality is hidden from an intimate partner. And that's why this concept of integrity abuse that we've already spoken about has been such an important part of this podcast. So you can see why moving from a codependency to a trauma model has a huge impact on how we understand the partner's experience. But if we also add in this understanding of deceptive sexuality being a potentially abusive dynamic that disempowers the partner, that takes us even further in our understanding of the partner's experience, and therefore what treatment and even relational justice will look like. So those are things we will talk about in later episodes, I'm sure. But for the purpose of today, let's bring it back to deceptive sexuality trauma and start with what are some of the key types of trauma that we need to be aware of to understand the experience a little bit more. Again, the scope of that is potentially very wide, but there's two key things I want to look at today, which are acute trauma and complex trauma. Acute trauma is what most people would probably think of when the word trauma is used in a mental health context. We might associate it with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, that idea of an acute experiencing of something traumatic, maybe a car accident, maybe being in a war zone or some form of sexual or physical violence. And in the context of this model, we can think of the impact of discovering the secret sexual basement, the shattering of reality that occurs as an acute traumatic event, which has an extremely destabilizing effect on a human being. And we can also think of the attachment injury that occurs alongside that as another part of the acute trauma. So this is extremely significant when we're talking about deceptive sexuality, that it's not only what was done, but it's also who did it. So it's the idea that my safe person, my go-to person, my primary attachment has caused this harm to me. And that idea can result in a significant attachment rupture and an acute loss of safety and trust in that attachment, which again can be experienced as acutely traumatic. And those acute impacts are generally the most obvious form of trauma that we'll see in partners. They have the most noticeable impact. And so it's the natural starting point when we're having this discussion. But it's also critical that we identify the other types of trauma that might have occurred or might even still be occurring. And for that, we really need to start thinking about complex trauma, or what we'll call in the DST model at least, complex trauma shaping. Complex trauma occurs when a person is subjected to repeated patterns of harm with a consistent theme that occur over a prolonged period in which the person lacks a viable escape route or is disempowered. I'll repeat that again because each point there is important. So complex trauma occurs when a person is subjected to repeated patterns of harm with a consistent theme that occur over a prolonged period in which the victim lacks a viable escape route or is disempowered. So for the acute trauma that we've mentioned, that the partner experiences upon discovery, we can use this helpful metaphor of a car crash. And in that metaphor, it's the idea of the two realities colliding. So the reality that the partner was living in, the manipulated reality, and then the reality as it actually was, containing the secret sexual basement. Those two realities crash together and cause that acute impact. Whereas for complex trauma shaping, on the other hand, we can use this metaphor of drops of water on a rock that shape the rock over time. And no single drop of water in this scenario causes any significant or noticeable damage to the rock, but over enough time, if the drops of water continue, the rock is gradually shaped. And the rock, in this case, represents the human psyche and the way that it might be shaped by those patterns of harm that are occurring over time, even though, again, the impacts might not be perceptible at any given moment. So if we now bring this back to the idea of the secret sexual basement, and particularly the pattern of behaviors that we call integrity abuse, Remember, we talked in an earlier episode about integrity abuse as a system of behaviors that covertly control and harm the partner. We can therefore fit this quite closely to our definition of complex trauma, a repeated pattern of harm with a consistent theme over a prolonged period of time. And due to the fact that the secret sexual basement is hidden, the partner is disempowered and potentially lacking a viable escape route, which is the other part of the definition we just used for complex trauma. Their ability to make fully informed, life-altering decisions is taken away from them. Hopefully you can see why this is such an important additional part of the trauma story for us to look at. We have the acute trauma, the obvious trauma, if you like, but due to the ongoing harm potentially being caused by the deception and manipulation, we have huge potential for complex trauma to have occurred as well. And this also means that we can think of trauma as having occurred prior to discovery, during the discovery, and to still be occurring after the discovery. Before the secret sexual basement was discovered, so when it was in the covert phase or was still being actively hidden, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that the partner isn't or wasn't being impacted by it. But we know that in reality, if we're understanding it through this lens of integrity abuse, of an ongoing pattern of harm occurring, then that's not necessarily true. So what might that harm actually look like? A simple addition to the metaphor we've used of the secret sexual basement might be helpful to visualize this idea. So imagine the basement being locked away, being hidden, but also imagine that fumes are gradually escaping from the basement. No matter how well the person thinks they've separated, compartmentalized it, the fumes are still escaping and seeping up into the home above and impacting, poisoning the people in the home above. And those fumes could represent things like relational neglect that might be occurring because of the time that one partner is spending in the basement. Or it could be from avoidance and lack of connection that might be occurring that again might be linked to the basement. And it also represents the potential gaslighting, the crazy making, the times when the partner maybe suspects something or has doubts but is told that they're imagining things. So all of these things can be those drops of water on the rock that are gradually impacting the safety and security of the relationship and therefore the intimate partner. If we then move on to what we call the exposure phase, which is when discovery of the basement occurs, and that's where we really get primarily to those acute traumatic injuries. So that's where we can move from this idea of the fumes escaping from the basement towards the image of the house collapsing into the basement below, which can again really help us to visualize that idea of the impact injury. But alongside that, throughout the exposure phase, again, if we have continued integrity abuse behaviors occurring in the form of perhaps trickle truths or partial disclosures, maybe defensiveness and justification, or DARVO and partner blaming, minimizing, stonewalling, all of those things that, again, we've talked about in previous episodes, we can be in a situation where, yes, acute trauma has occurred, but ongoing complex trauma shaping is still occurring because of those patterns of harm. And that can really continue often for a very long time. And crucially, as we've discussed before, it can continue long after the sexual acting out is no longer occurring. The person that built the basement can stop the sexual behavior, stop engaging in what we call the CES behaviors. But if the integrity abuse is continuing, then the partner is still not in a position of safety in the relationship. She still does not know her reality. And when she's not safe, there is a high likelihood for complex trauma shaping to continue. Now, I'm going to stop there for today because it might be a lot to take in, but as a quick recap, we can go back to the evolution of this field in general, from the outright pathologizing of the partners by using labels like codependency, towards seeing that the partner's reactions are understandable trauma responses caused by that acute impact of discovery. But we also have this need to continue evolving, which I do believe is slowly happening. And this next step is towards understanding the abusive nature of deceptive sexuality and to illuminate this other complex trauma story that is occurring before, during, and after the discovery of the secret sexual basement. So over the next couple of episodes, we're going to look at these traumatic impacts in more depth, and we'll start that journey next time by looking at the trauma reactions and responses we might expect from a partner experiencing deceptive sexuality trauma, and then also consider the victim blaming that can still occur because of those reactions. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.